Hello, everyone. Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Ethics and Equity in the Workplace program brought to you in partnership with the Laidley Centre for Business Ethics and Equity here at McGill. It's wonderful to see you all back after the new year. We're so glad to have you with us for our fourth session. Before we get started, let us acknowledge that McGill University is on land that has once long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which most of us now gather. Today's session is the fourth of five, and we'll be touching on questions of ethics as it relates to capitalism. I will introduce this session speaker in just a moment, but a few quick items of housekeeping before I hand over the floor. As you know, these sessions are recorded so that those who are not able to attend in real time may still have access to the program's content. Also, as a note, we would love to see some of your faces. So if you're comfortable with turning your camera on so we can make this session as engaging as possible, I encourage you to do so. In terms of asking questions, if you'd like to respond to a question or contribute to the discussion, we ask that you just raise your virtual hand and only unmute yourself when called upon. And of course, if you're not comfortable asking a question out loud for whichever reason, please send me a message using the chat and I will be happy to ask on your behalf. Now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce this evening's presenter, Saku Mantere. Saku is a professor of strategy and organization and the editor-in-chief of Delve, the faculty's thought leadership publication, which features the latest in management thinking that stretches perspectives, sparks new ideas, and brings clarity to decision makers at all levels and across sectors. I highly recommend you all check it out. Over to you, Saku.
Alrighty, thanks, Island. Good evening, everybody. Glad to be here in my own home office here in NDG. Glad to speak to you all. As Island said, if possible, it would be lovely if I could see you, so I could have the sense of us speaking to a live audience. And I can assure you that there is better content in YouTube in terms of sort of just flair and charisma than what I can offer. But sort of if we have a little bit of an exchange, we can actually sort of make much more of this. I've been asked to talk about ethics and capitalism. That's probably because I teach an undergrad course called Origins of Capitalism at Desautels, and I'm trained as an engineer and as a philosopher. So I did master's degrees in both when I was growing up, and then ended up being an organization theorist. But sort of I have this pretty plural set of interests. And I guess when we look at what's happening in the world at the moment, for instance, yesterday, you may have read the news that Mark Zuckerberg announced that Facebook would be pulling back from fact checking, for instance. You know, we're kind of entering into this seemingly turbulent and perhaps somewhat dark period in the world where corporate executives and business owners are starting to enter the political realm. I guess, you know, the questions around ethics and capitalism, or, you know, another example, of course, Elon Musk, you know, using Twitter to target European heads of state, so the richest man in the world, you know, using political authority whilst not being voted into office. So it's an interesting time to reflect on the state of capitalism, and sort of, is there room for ethics in capitalism? If so, what and how is that possible? So I don't have any more text in my slides, so I've used asked my very good friend Dolly, which is a part of ChatGPT, to generate some images for me. So I'm acknowledging, you know, the contribution of OpenAI into the graphics of what I'm presenting. They're there mainly to kind of structure the presentation and prime you a little bit. But if you find that type of aesthetic offensive, I apologize in advance. So let's see if I can get this thing to work. Here we go. So business ethics, if we start with the question of what is business ethics, I find myself despairing on occasion on the very notion of business ethics. Is such a thing possible? Mainly because it seems to be practiced in a way that has seemingly very little to do with ethics. So, business ethics suggests almost like an aesthetic of a worldview where sort of Western middle class ideas on sustainability come together in the corporate space. That we have a picture, being primed to talk about sort of a positive view of business ethics. This is what OpenAI generated. So it's a kind of this verdant, beautiful corporate campus where happy and intelligent people wearing suits are engaging in this sort of healthy and happy lifestyle. Business ethics is an aesthetics. It's sometimes it's used as a regulatory framework in a company that sort of ethics points to rules that are supposedly followed, or ethics points to a particular corporate unit that does perhaps sustainability or EDI or sort of imposes some regulations on other parts of the business. Ethics, on the other hand, sort of there's a much deeper meaning to what ethics means. So the word comes from Greek ethos. Ideas of good and evil, wrong and right are founded in the notion of ethics. So then is there a way for us to expect companies to do good deeds genuinely if they are there to make a profit? The corporation as a legal form is relatively young. So the corporation was invented a couple of hundred years ago for colonialist purposes. So one of the earliest corporations was the Hudson Bay Company that was given a royal charter by the British Crown to colonize Canada. So there was an expectation in the colonial period that a corporation that is a partnership of capital was endowed limited liability. The idea that you invest in such a partnership, the most that you could lose with your investment was your money that you put in. So you couldn't be sued for more damages based on what the company would do, nor could you be held liable for anything that the company did, which is actually pretty different, with many other organizational forms. You're a member of an organization, and if the organization commits illegal acts or sort of is being sued for damages, you might end up being personally accountable as a member of an association, for instance. So the corporation actually gets this added edge from a legal jurisdiction, which is limited liability. So it's granted the right to be a person and to be bankrupt as a corporate person, keeping its investors safe. And this is actually that is granted to corporations by legal jurisdictions. For instance, Canada has law that endows corporations with that right. So there's this expectation in the colonial period, the kind of expectation of service to society was basically colonial pursuits. We know that some of the early, like Royal African Company in the United Kingdom, was involved in slave trade. So many of those social goods, as they were called back then, wouldn't be recognized by us anymore. But still, the idea, this kind of a bargain that for corporations to be allowed to exist, they need to they should earn the right to be granted limited liability by governments. I think our normal expectations on how they should be, sort of what they do is that they fuel the economy, they provide jobs, they do all these things that are helpful for us. But the answer then, because of course the other view of business ethics is this. It's a pretty gloomy picture, where corporate society is destroying our environment, is kind of making our lives meaningless, alienating us from from our vibrant capacity to live by giving us these meaningless jobs and so on. So depending on who you ask, if you ask a left-leaning thinker, you get a notion of corporate ethics or business ethics that business ethics is an oxymoron and businesses really are not capable of it. And you ask somebody towards the right, normally you either get the classical liberal answer that corporations are driving growth and everybody's yanked up by their bootstraps. The rising tide lifts all boats, which is the liberal classical discourse. Or then there's this sort of almost like an apologist discourse that corporations have actually cleaned up their act and corporate executives are people like everybody else, and they have the same types of possibilities of virtue and vice as anybody else. So we can actually see corporations operating in this type of mode. But ultimately, if you want to understand the question of business ethics, we have to ask the question of capitalism as a system. Otherwise, I don't think it really makes much sense. Otherwise, because the corporation is there to by law to deliver profits to its shareholders. That's unless it's defined otherwise. We've of course seen, say, B Corps and other types of organizational forms popping up which are trying to mix the bag a little bit. But the mainstream corporation, as is defined by legislation, is an instrument of making money. So it's a tool. Actually, it's funny. The word organization comes from the Latin organum, which means tool. So organizations are tools for accomplishing some purposes. And as we know, you can kill a person with a shovel, and you can dig a well with a shovel. So you can tools have this double meaning. They're ethically complex or neutral, depending on how you think. So, but for us to understand, what is it that business ethics could be, we have to ask the question about ethics in capitalism. So, is capitalist as a system? Because capitalism is founded on corporations. Nowadays, capitalism runs on corporations. The actors of capitalism are legal persons that are corporations typically. Some of them, of course, might have very, very visible people at their helm, like Elon Musk is very, very visible. But most corporations are these artificial personae who exhibit the capitalist system, doing what they were meant to do, which is to make money within those legal frameworks that bind them. But of course, often, since international law isn't very effective nowadays, they also kind of operate between the legal systems that are trying to regulate them. So what is capitalism in itself? So capitalism, it's a funny question, because at one level, China is almost a capitalism now, at least self-attributes, capitalism, or at least a capitalist market to its operation. And Denmark is a capitalist country. And those two countries or Finland, where I come from, or Canada, which are actually pretty similar, all those three are different takes on a welfare state. But they're still capitalist countries. And there's actually, as opposed to some theocracies, we actually have very few governments nowadays, few states that don't somehow self-attribute to be capitalist. So what is capitalism then? What are when I teach my course, the origins of capitalism, that's the first frustration that students often have, is that can I have a definition, please? And it's actually pretty hard to give a very good definition of capitalism. The way that I approach it, that capitalism has these two aspects to it. So on the one hand, it is a technological system, which, in a sense, is a neutral description of what it is. So capitalism is a system for allocating resources in a distributed manner. This can be understood, against, the planning economies of communism as they were supposedly operating. That there was an office somewhere that made plans, 5-year plans, typically about sort of producing, making surveys on what the populace would need, and they would make plans about sort of producing those, and then setting, salaries and prices and everything, from top down. So it was a centralized system of resource allocation. The capitalist alternative to that is perhaps captured by a conversation that Gorbachev, the then chief secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, when he was visiting Margaret Thatcher in the UK, the then prime minister, and Gorbachev asked Thatcher, how is it that how is it that you give your people how is it that you make sure that your people have bread to eat, have their daily bread? And Thatcher responded in a very, very sort of, capitalist way. I do not, Mr. Chief Secretary, it is the market that does that. So capitalism is based on this distributed system where sort of resources are allocated between economic actors rather than being allocated from top down or from the center to periphery. There's all sorts of good reasons why that's a pretty good idea, and sort of it also demonstrates why we've had, in a certain sense, such a good run as humanity for centuries now with the development of capitalism. Of course, I'm sure that sort of the slaves that were transported to Africa by the royal from Africa by the by the early companies, by the Royal Africa Company, for instance, that they wouldn't agree that capitalism has had a good run. But sort of if you look at, the technological developments, you look at global health stats, you look at all sorts of metrics, capitalism has been very, very efficient in its operating. So, the way where people know what they need themselves, they're not represented by some central government who's predicting how many pairs of rubber boots need to be made in each year, and sort of what would be the right price for a pair of rubber boots. Then the type of distributed system, that's the miracle of capitalism, that it actually is in many ways a very smart system collectively for allocating resources. It also incentivizes competition, and through competition, innovation. It does all sorts of wonderful things, and with it, arguably, sort of our contemporary democracy has evolved. Because when capitalism, one of the hallmarks of such a system is the institution that you need is private property. And sort of before U.S. revolution, we really didn't have a lot of jurisdictions with any notion of a private property that was universal. But once you start giving, universal private property to people, they're going to start demanding rights. And then democracies have kind of lived on this notion that sort of, individuals are endowed with the rights to own their property. The problem, obviously, is that sort of, the very history of capitalism has been one of exploitation. And the second part is that capitalism isn't self-correcting when it comes to sustainability. So it does that very poorly. So it sort of just eats up all the resources that it can. So it doesn't, we've known about climate change for quite some time, and sort of we really haven't seen effective responses to it. And the second thing is it's not self-correcting with inequality. So it tends to sort of, inequality tends to fester in a capitalist system. One of the reasons is that very few of us would be willing to accept the 100% inheritance tax rate, for instance, which would be very, very consistent with the liberal ideas of capitalism, where the individual is rewarded for their hard work and risk-taking and whatever, and not a family. So, the capitalism is also founded on institutions that constantly sort of, don't level the playing field, quite the opposite. So there's this notion that it's a wonderful technology that's almost utopian in its capacity of driving growth, productivity, innovation over generations. Now it seems that sort of, the ecological and the social problems that we're facing might mean that it's come to a standstill. Who knows? So it's the current historical situation, it kind of boggles the mind. But then capitalism is not just a marvelous and slightly scary technology. It's also an ideology. So capitalism is a belief system about values, about human beings. What is a human being? For capitalism, human being is an individual who is directed by self-interest. For capitalism, fairness is founded, or sort of justice is founded on notion of negative liberty. The idea that to maintain this distributed system, the state should stay at arm's length from people's affairs. It's the notion of, and you can read about it in the classic Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism that Max Weber wrote more than 100 years ago, where sort of he describes an interesting process where through a process of rationalization, what was initially a religious belief system, Calvinism, which is the type of belief system where your material success was used as a proxy for your virtue, for your sort of standing as a good Christian. It's just that the religion left, and what was left was just the material success. So material success was regarded to be an end in itself, and the affiliated assumptions about, for instance, time is money, and everything that comes with it, this notion. So it's unfair to say that sort of capitalism operates just as a neutral technology. It requires a belief system, an ideology to function. Does that make sense? Am I making any sense this far? It's kind of gloomy. Lindsay is showing me the finger. That's good. Cool. All right. So I'm going to continue a little bit because I'm going to make this is kind of pretty standard social scientific stuff applied to business ethics, but sort of this is where it gets a little bit more spicy because I'm going to start poking at some hornet's nest here. I'm going to start with the notion of disenchantment, which is a concept that comes from Max Weber as well. I mentioned Max Weber's famous analysis on the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism, but one of his really powerful concepts that seems to resonate even more and more today is the notion of disenchantment, and sort of we're leading a life that, if you look at the picture, I think actually sort of, because I just asked ChatGPT to provide a picture of modern disenchantment, so I think it did pretty well here. So it is kind of this alienation that we're feeling from life, from vibrancy, from being capable of expressing ourselves. So there's so many of us. We have all these stats that are published all the time about how people are disenchanted with their jobs, that they felt that the world would be a better place if their job didn't exist. So there was a poll in the UK done a couple of years ago where I think it was around 40% of the people who were answering felt that the world would be a better place if their job didn't exist. So what kind of an alienated state, disenchanted state is that? And sort of but also sort of when we look at the world, when we look at sort of what happens in politics, the lack of engagement, when we look at what's how people, so climate change, rather than a needy challenge to be tackled, it's treated with anxiety. So it's like sort of there's this strange feeling of petrification almost that we feel with the world has always had challenges. When I was growing up in the 70s, 80s, it was the nuclear race, and there was the greenhouse effect, not the greenhouse effect, but the ozone layer. And the ozone layer was fixed. Actually, there was a group of people, politicians, that came together in Montreal and sort of set up a protocol that sort of if not totally, people in Australia still have a lot of skin cancer, but still it's sort of it's gotten a lot better. But sort of we have this notion that somehow we can't we're not in touch with life. And I think the best example for me this is that I don't know how you've had. I just read from social media that a professorial colleague in Helsinki, where I'm from, in Finland, had his appendix burst in the ER because they didn't treat him early enough. So he was waiting for basically like sort of one day in one hospital, then transported, first misdiagnosed, then waiting one day in one hospital and waiting for a second day in a second hospital with appendicitis, and his appendix burst. And sort of it's actually, I've heard a similar story from Canada, that our ERs, the experience of going to an ER in Montreal, which is a wealthy Western nation where we pay a pretty heavy tax for our income. People can't even get family doctors, and the experience of going to a doctor, I think that has shifted. So there's so many experiences of healthcare which have nothing to do with health or with care. So that there's this idea that the organizations are operating under tighter and tighter metrics of sort of quality control and performance productivity, and they've ended up becoming these factories where we're doing procedures rather than sort of tending to people's health, caring for health. So I don't know. So of course there are exceptions, but it seems that sort of healthcare seems to be wherever you read in the West, you read discourse on healthcare, it seems that sort of people feel that healthcare systems are in crisis. We encounter that in the International Health Leadership Master's program that we teach at McGill, where we have always an international group of nascent health leaders who are on their way to become leaders in their fields. And sort of that's the same story. I had one emergency room physician, head of an emergency room from a Canadian city, telling me that sort of nothing would change if my job would cease, because she was running the emergency room, and she felt that there was just her job was to patch up a bunch of drug addicts, people suffering from addiction that would come in, they would patch them up, they would go out, and they would come back, and they would patch them up again, and so nothing would change. So because addiction wasn't something that they were able to treat within the constraints of the system. So it seems that there's the Weberian notion of disenchantment, which is that when rationalization gets into a system, it drives out life, it drives out value. It's sort of the only thing that is left is this blind metric. And this, I think, this is where things become interesting for business ethics and ethics of capitalism, because this notion of this is the healthcare thing that I was healthcare without health or care. But the one thing that sort of I think we should challenge much more is the notion of scaling. So scale is the buzzword for sort of whenever we talk about things like values-based management, sustainability, sort of social impact, we always think about we ask questions about does this scale up? Is what you're offering as a solution, is it ripe to sort of be replicated and across the world, and can it sort of heal all of the world's problems, like some new technological app? And I think there's something really dangerous with this idea, and I think we've gone way too far with the idea of scaling up. So we've lost sight of another part of ethics, which is care. And sort of caring and scaling, those are two very, very different philosophies on how ethics operates. So scale is about replication, generalization, abstraction. And what happens when you scale is you inevitably you colonize. You sort of have a solution, one size fits all problem, and then you lose sight of the context where you're trying to be helpful. Care, on the other hand, is something that's characterized by meeting an individual first and foremost, understanding an individual in their unique context. Going back to healthcare, that's what's being lost when you sort of start tightening your metrics and rationalizing and disenchanting the organization, is that the one part of healthcare which might actually be one of the most important parts, which is the human encounter, between a care worker and the care recipient is lost. So care, the ethics of care, challenges this notion that ethics is accomplished with sort of universal, scalable solutions, and it's founded on a connection. It also challenges the notion that ethics is essentially rational. So it pushes the idea that ethics needs to incorporate, both key aspects of human experience, rationality and emotion, which is actually a pretty spicy topic once we start thinking about it, because we often like to think that we should be impartial and we should be, we should kind of temper our emotions and sort of let our reason draw the best conclusions. But the ethics of care actually says that we can go too far, because if you lose sight of emotion, you lose sight of life. So caring is impossible without feeling, as well as, of course, reasoning. The other really important aspect of sort of, the types of critique that the ethics of care would push against scaling is the notion that really we don't understand each other very well, still. So Lindsay is a narrative scholar, and sort of Lindsay could tell us, probably interesting evidence of how literacy has made human beings much more empathetic, because we're able to identify with life experience that is very different from us. And that's, that there's evidence that actually sort of, empathy, the capacity for empathy was enhanced by the introduction of the novel. The romance novels were actually apparently, very important for allowing people to empathize with each other. There's this notion that still, despite all this, when we talk about, there was a land acknowledgement that was done at the beginning of the speech. We still understand, I think the work that's being done by First Nations authors who are then accounting their trauma experiences, say in the residential schools, the movies that are being made, the narratives that are being told, is so important, because, when I moved to Canada as a Scandinavian, I thought I was liberal and I thought I was sort of pretty emancipated in many different ways, but I couldn't even begin to understand what the colonial experience was. So, and the ethics of care kind of focuses, the more you scale, the more you lose in your capacity to care. And to create organizations and institutions that are actually vibrant, that are fighting against disenchantment, over rationalization. So the question I'm about to conclude, because I've been asked to provide a space for a discussion. I'm sure that we actually can have a lively discussion about it. But to revisit the question about ethics and capitalism, the question for me is that, can we envision a capitalist system which would be capable of tempering its tendencies of scalability, allowing for more context, allowing for emotionality, and allowing for individuality, allowing for care? For me, that seems to be the central question. Or are we going to see whatever the capitalist system has become, are we going to see that, collapse into something else? Who knows? The only thing that we can hope for is it's a gradual, transformation rather than violent revolt. But perhaps I'll stop here and take a few questions, if that's okay. Lindsay, I see that you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to get the
Well, I was
conversation
just going to
going?
say, too much for people to think about. A really great. I really appreciated your take on these things. Okay, I see Stephen has a question now, but I think there's a lot of really important things for us to process. I think that's why there was a bit of a lag, but I'll turn it over to Stephen now.
Yeah, so Saku, thanks for that. It was very deep. So I'm trying to figure out certain things. But one thing that I don't know what the connection with capitalism is, because maybe I don't know enough about capitalism. But what I do find of business is largely business seems to be having to deal with people. And what I've been finding, even at McGill, is that there seems to be a lack of empathy of the individual, and it seems as and so you seem to make an excuse that says, oh, if I'm overlooking hundreds of people, I can't afford to be I can't afford to look at an individual. And so you go back to this I'm objective thing. And then suddenly it's as if nobody cares about you in particular, even though you're trying to perform what the company wants you to do, and yet you feel like you're being stymied against, let's call it productivity, by people who seem to be ignoring you as an individual and thinking, oh, well, it's for the benefit of the whole group. But then I go back and say, yeah, but I'm the part of the group. If without me, you don't have a group. So I get back to this thing that I think finally said, that scaling you seem to lose a lot of stuff in terms of the individual. But on the other hand, scaling's an issue, as you know, as an engineer. Things that work in the lab don't work if you don't think about scaling. So I guess I'm looking to you to say, okay, what's the solution? Can you have scaling and still consider, oh yeah, you have a foible, I'll try and work that into the scaling up thing.
Okay, so that's a great question. I sort of, I think I'm going to start with the last one. So, what is it? What is the solution with scalability, scaling? I think it's not a matter of either or. I think scalability, it is, and also, even if we wanted to sort of, it would not cease to be an issue. But I think it's a matter of balancing. So it's a matter of yin and yang, sort of, the yang of scalability, which tends to think, I think that the university example that you gave was great. That sort of a university or any type of organization where a leader says that, I'm not going to pay attention to you because I have 100 souls to kind of, guide here. And sort of we have the system that does that so that the organizational structure kind of governs you already. So that's an organization where there's no leadership. Because the leadership that we expect is the human connection. It is the purpose of what we're doing, and sort of it's not, there's an aspect of fairness that sort of course a leader needs to treat each and every employee fairly against some standard. That's important, but simultaneously it's important that the leader needs to see them as individuals and different and unique. So there's this idea that somehow if we lose sight of the idea of the individual and just focus on sort of, the scalability aspect, we're going to treat the organization as a technology. And sort of people are just, if you remember the Modern Times movie where Charlie Chaplin was caught up into the wheels of this great machine. So that's the type of organization that we have, where people really don't matter. Because the organizational technology does not care about anybody. It's not in its nature to care, It governs, it sort of, it follows its rules, it imposes its rules, it distributes, it allocates resources, it does the stuff that it does, but it doesn't lead, it doesn't, and leadership arguably is founded on people experiencing that they're seen and they're heard and treated as with dignity. So we're not sort of, to be treated with dignity, my individuality needs to be acknowledged somehow. Does that make sense, Stephen? So for me, the solution is not to say that sort of scalability is irrelevant, but sort of I'm saying that it's too relevant because it's become this all-encompassing concern, and we've lost sight of the legitimacy of care.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see what you're saying, and it's kind of what I said, right? That it feels like you need to have the individuality thing, but you can't escape the technology at this point, unless something weird happens, like you say, oh, maybe AI can look after everybody, because it might be that a manager wants to deal with individuals, but it doesn't have the they don't have the resource. So maybe AI has that not intellectual capacity, but the sort of quantitative capacity to look after everybody as individuals. I mean, maybe that's something. But
yeah, so one example of that, sort of when we're sort of applying the idea of scaling to AI, I think a pretty disturbing tendency that I see. I don't know if you have Manulife insurance, but at McGill we have Manulife insurance, and they and sort of when you go to the Manulife site to kind of submit your expense reports or whatever sort of insurance reports, they have these, and they're sending emails about AI assisted therapies, because we know that mental health is one of the major costs of healthcare, rising. If you look at the WHO reports globally, mental health ailments are beginning to be the highest the most expensive ailments. So what Manulife is then the insurance companies are developing these AI bots, therapy bots like crazy, and sort of these automated trainings and systems and sort of bots that you can have bleed your heart out to, so that they can scale, so that they can get the productivity gains from that. It makes perfect sense, but it's also kind of gruesome, the idea that if therapy, so those who can't afford human care then are going to be talking to a bot that costs nothing. And in leadership, yeah, it can do the same thing. You can train it, on the corpus of text that is your strategy, and it can sort of communicate with your employees day and night about sort of strategic choices. So, it's just tireless as a communicator. What it doesn't do is that it doesn't see or hear people. So having had any communication with any of these customer service bots, I'm sure that sort of we all share the experience that you don't really feel seen or heard when you have to deal with them.
yeah, but I got the same problem with people now. Right? So, like I said, when you deal with the upper management, it's like you're not a person. You're just some sort of number that may or may not be useful in the final goal of whatever it is, the final goal of McGill University.
So, Stephen, that's what I meant when I said that disenchantment can be defined by rationalization going so far that sort of value leaves the space. So life leaves the space and values leave. The only thing that remains is the metric. We see, in academic work, for instance, one of these tendencies is that, the quality of teaching is measured by student evaluations, that you get the numbers and then there's like a blind interpretation. You get more than 4 out of 5, you're okay. And then, you get tenure, you get your bonus or whatever. It's less than, 4, then it's something else. Or you were supposed to be, in the kind of pushing the boundary of knowledge outward, and sort of what actually are being followed now are sort of these publication metrics, that you have journalists and you have impact factors, and sort of another example of sort of where the value of scientific knowledge production is kind of leaving the room. and what remains is this blind metric that, we say of a colleague that, he has a publication in this and that journal, and that defines the colleague rather than their ideas as it used to be. I'd love to hear from a lot of you, what kinds of thoughts that this are.
There's a question in the chat that I will read to you. And it says, in your view and from your experience of studying organizations over many years, which country has achieved sort of the closest thing to the idea of ethical capitalism, in your opinion?
That's a very good question, sort of, and of course, this is somewhat of a personal opinion, because I haven't sort of done consistent research across cultures. I think, but let's just say that sort of, I've lived in Finland and in Canada and in the UK and in France a little bit. So in this is sort of, welfare state contexts, where sort of we have where you have a relatively strong state. And it seems that rather than finding a model example, I think, disenchantment is rampaging across the world. So, we're seeing, the Americanization of, for instance, in the university context where I work, across Europe. So, Europe and Asia are becoming Americanized. The university systems are being aligned with the US system, which has been heavily metrics based for a while. You read about healthcare. I don't know of a single nation where healthcare is doing well. I don't know if you know of an example of a single nation where healthcare is doing really well. I know a lot of examples where it doesn't seem, it isn't doing. People are sort of feeling that it's in crisis. So in that sense, I think this notion of disenchantment, it is an aspect of late capitalism, and sort of finding kind of a model positive outlier might be hard.
Thank you. We still have a few more minutes left, so if anyone else has any questions that they would like to ask or comments that they would like to make related to anything that Saku has said, we do have time.
Jennifer has her hand up, I think.
Hello.
Hi.
Very interesting. Very interesting thoughts that you have raised around ethics and capitalism. I work in journalism and the media. This is my son behind me. But as an individual who cares about some of the issues that you have talked about, I was just curious to get your thoughts, or anybody else on the call, around what we as individuals can do to help both in our organizations and also as citizens to I guess really emphasize or try and promote some of the things you're talking about in terms of care in our capitalistic world, because it's here and you can't, really avoid it. And I think about myself as an investor, for example, investing in a lot of these companies that are capitalistic and wondering how I can be more ethical in my investments. And so I just kind of wanted to put that question out there in terms of what we as individuals can do to try and get people to, or companies to think about caring about individuals, both who work in their companies and also as the people they serve.
So it's interesting because it seems that in investing, and that's obviously sort of we're all kind of in the same boat, because it's our pension money that's basically sort of driving the capitalist system. I think it's a kind of a devious challenge, because for investment, sort of the metrics that we get, they tend to be sort of performance metrics, or then we might get some compliance to some rationalized standard or system. I think for me, the answer begins with how is it that we legitimize caring? So how do we make care as an ethos legitimate? How do we make it a legitimate concern to meet individuals as individuals with dignity? How can we temper, this sort of scaling madness with good contextual understanding of what we're doing? And I'm right today, I was teaching a class to our retail master students on creativity, and we were talking about what it feels like to play. When do we give ourselves the opportunity to be open and play? And I think this type of mindset that it induces, it's not antithetical to ethical concerns or capacity to play and to breathe and to live. So I think in some sense this is related to a question of how do we learn to live again in this disenchanted world? How do we resist in a legitimate fashion the tendencies to scale everything into us becoming machines? And those are the answers. So, and I think it starts at the micro level. It really sort of starts at the encounters that we have as human beings, the way that we treat our students, and the kinds of ideological ideology critique. Asking the question is that is all this organizing that we're faced with, is it actually making us happy? Could we actually rebel against some of its most machinistic tendencies? But you're a journalist, then how do you write with vibrancy? How do you write texts that are beautiful and that inspire people to live in this economy? Get life back into our society and our economy.
I might actually add something to Jennifer. I concur wholeheartedly with everything that Saku had said. I also think, and in a way it's what he's saying, but I also think that leaning into those one-on-one connections that you're making through a range of activities, not just strictly mentorship activities, but I'm thinking about the way in which my efforts toward enhancing our concerns regarding ethics broadly have been very small and incremental bonds that one makes as one identifies others who care about these same things. This is not a new concept, but I do think it's something that people do less and less as a result of this idea. And I think that young people are sometimes being crushed under the weight of this idea that somehow everything they do has to impact hundreds of people, or every sustainable measure I take has to have a major impact on the environment, or it's not worth my effort, right? It has to have some sort of massive impact. And I think coming back, the interesting thing about the ethics of care is that it is returning our thinking to those individual moments of contact, and applied to the medical arena as Saku has, it's the benefit of that contact, not just for the patient but for the physician, that one-on-one moment. And I'm finding that leaning into those, and I wanted to bring it up in part because one of them involves a journalist with whom I made contact years ago. And I just reached out to this journalist, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. I just reached out and thanked her for her work. And as a result, I've been teaching her work for years and have a relationship with her. And her work is now, as a result, benefiting a range of different people. And she recognizes as a result that valuable work is actually having a concrete impact on individuals. And I think just that was wonderful. I loved that moment. I think just remembering that taking the time to craft emails and benefit from those interactions truly does have a concrete impact. And I think that having our Center for Ethics now, and we're looking to hire a chair in ethics, and these things happen as a result of sort of a faith in those small interactions with individuals that ethics of care embraces.
Yeah, I think the world, has come to a point where sort of, we've rationalized so far, and the kind of resultant, sustainability and equity outcomes have become so blatant that sort of, we're seeing politics that's completely irrational. That's sort of basically sort of a violent resistance to a world that we've ceased to understand. So in a certain sense, I think, the legitimacy of thought that is proximal, that is, focusing on what's right ahead of us, what good can we do in our everyday encounters, in our work, the kind of attention that we give to those that we lead, addressing the legitimacy of those activities, for me, seems to be the first step. It's not saying that sort of, scaling doesn't have its merits, but it's, as I said, it's a matter of balancing. All right, I think we've come more or less to the conclusion of this meeting. I hope that you gained something from this talk. I certainly, got a lot out of the conversation. It was a pleasure to meet everybody. And I guess, who is it that wishes us a good evening? Is it you, Lindsay, or is it you, Island?
It's me. So good evening. Thank you, Saku, for that insightful presentation. It was lovely to hear from you, and it was lovely to hear all of those of you who engaged. We appreciate you so much for being here. And as a reminder, our next session and final session is 3 weeks from today, and it will be a capstone with Lindsay and her colleague Tatiana Gauvin, who will go over everything that's been discussed in the last 4 sessions and set you up for success for the little evaluation that will be sent out for you to achieve your attestation of having completed this course. With that in mind, you will hear from me shortly with the link to the recording from this session, as well as the link to the next session. And I hope you all have a great evening.
Bye. Thank you.